You're listening to Everybody Pulls the Tarp, the go-to podcast for high performers. I'm Andrew Moses. Each week, you'll hear my thought-provoking conversations with Olympians, pro athletes, CEOs, elite coaches, best-selling authors, and other high performers to uncover their secrets to success. Get ready to be inspired each week when we talk about leadership, teamwork, work ethic, and more. Are you ready? Let's go. This week, my guest is Hootie and the Blowfish drummer and two-time Grammy Award winner, Jim Sonefeld. In 1989, Jim and bandmates Mark Bryan, Dean Felber, and Darius Rucker were playing gigs at small bars and fraternity parties at the University of South Carolina. They booked their own gigs, hung up posters to promote their shows, and scraped money together to reserve time at local recording studios. In 1994, they released their first album, Cracked Rear View, and it went on to become a massive success. The album featured now iconic hits like Hold My Hand, Let Her Cry, and Only Want to Be With You, and the album hit number one on the Billboard charts. Today, Cracked Rear View is still one of the top 10 best-selling albums of all time. The band went on to win 2 Grammy Awards, release 6 more studio albums, and have sold over 25 million albums worldwide. In 2019, much to the delight of Hootie fans like me, the band went out on tour to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Cracked Rear View album. They sold out venues across the US and Canada and dazzled fans with entertaining, high-energy shows. And I had the great fortune of seeing them play in Bristow, Virginia, which ended up being one of the biggest shows on the entire tour. Jim and I sat down a few weeks ago to talk about his extraordinary career and explore many of the success secrets that have made Hootie and the Blowfish one of history's most iconic bands. We dove deep into the mindsets and techniques that powered the band's creative process, tireless work ethic, and absolutely relentless persistence. In our conversation, Jim also talks candidly about his battle with addiction and how he ultimately charted a path to recovery, which he also details in his inspiring and deeply moving new memoir, Swimming with the Blowfish. My conversation with Jim is a raw and emotional look at the highs and lows that often come with success. And it's filled with so many powerful lessons on building something from the ground up, overcoming adversity, and so much more. I can't wait for you to hear it. So, let's pull the tarp and get straight to Jim Sonefeld.
Jim, where I want to begin, I want to go back to the days at University of South Carolina. You're living in a house that burns down. A few nights later, a bunch of guys on a stage playing some music decide to pass a hat and raise some money for you when they didn't even know you that well. That group of guys and you ended up forming Hootie and the Blowfish. What do you remember about that gesture that night? And what does it mean to you?
My vivid memory is of Mark Bryan's very sweaty University of Maryland ball cap that the money was put in. It was about $36, which was a big deal in 1989. I remember going to the side stage when he called me up, and I was still sort of dumbfounded by the gesture because I didn't know them well. I knew Mark from a class that we had together in audio production, but I didn't know the other guys. And they together used their influence. They used their desire to help somebody else who they barely or didn't know while they were on stage. They basically stopped the show, and I just thought, wow, here's a sweaty ball cap with $35 that I didn't have a few minutes ago, and it's out of the love of these 4 guys on stage. So that is a beautiful memory for me, one that didn't fully strike me till I was writing the book, when I had to really remember back, what was it about our beginning that was so either unique or dramatic? And it was that moment of sort of charity or love that they gave to me.
I was going to say that, Jim. I would imagine that a moment like that, whether you realize it at the time or not, it must subconsciously create this comfort and sense of community and sense of love, like you described.
Well, it certainly was something for me to remember 6 months later as I'm auditioning for Hootie and the Blowfish. Their original drummer, Brantley Smith, was leaving the band, but I didn't know at the time, near the fire when I was getting a hat full of money, of from Hootie the Blowfish. I didn't know that Brantley was considering whether he would stay in the band or not after they all graduated. And so 6 months later, what is my memory of Hootie the Blowfish? All this crazy group of guys on stage that passed the hat for me. Like, what other memory do I need to say that might be the best band for me to fit in? That, along with the fact they were wanting to write original material. And that was what I was interested in.
It struck me in the book, you talk about that audition, when you auditioned to be the drummer, as they were forming Hootie and the Blowfish. The audition happened at a 10-foot by 20-foot self-storage unit. And I just think, humble beginnings. What was that day like? And are you sitting there thinking to yourself, hey, we're going to go on to win 2 Grammys, tour the world, and have a top 10 selling album of all time when you're sitting in that self-storage garage?
The funny thing is that self-storage unit, which was hideous, metal walls, concrete floor, one light bulb swinging from the middle of the ceiling. It's the worst place to ever make loud music. That place was a step up from where we were going to be off and on for the next year or two. We were in a living room. We were in a bedroom. We were in a self-storage unit. We were in an office. We would rehearse sometimes out where Mark worked at it was the receiver antenna for a TV station in Colombia. So there was a room that he was in charge of to make sure the antenna was working. And we would go out there and play. So that room wasn't horrible. It just wasn't meant to have music be made in it. We eventually upgraded a little bit, but we only could afford so much. And frankly, rehearsal space shouldn't be too comfortable, because then you just want to hang out all night and drink beer and talk instead of getting to the business of rehearsing.
Let's get into the business of rehearsing and just the absolute grit and determination and willingness that you guys had to grind it out. As I sit here talking to you, Jim, I think about a conversation I had a while back with Mike Mills from REM, and I feel like the stories have some parallels. I read in the book that you described the mindset for Hootie and the Blowfish in the early days as very simple. Let's write, let's practice, and let's play gigs. You booked your own gigs, you hung up your own posters, you saved money for the recording studio time when you could swing it, as you just described there. Where did that humble mindset and work ethic come from, do you think, for the 4 of you?
We never would have labeled it humility, I'll tell you that. We frankly enjoyed the process. Yeah, we knew we all grew up with a work ethic. Thank you to all of our parents for that. But mainly it was that we were enjoying hanging out. We didn't mind hard work. We all were creative minded. So while we didn't have anybody that wanted to manage us or take the lead, we had a little necessity to promote ourselves. So we could draw up some flyers. We could call a few clubs ourselves. We could spread the word. And, when there's nobody there for you or wanting to run the show, you just do it. And we used the means that we had in the early 90s. We weren't interrupted, I'll say, by cell phones and by a lot of devices in our lives. When you went to a rehearsal studio, you were at the rehearsal studio. There was no, I say studio, self-storage unit. When you went there was no cell phone. There was no phone line. There was no way to get in touch with somebody. You were locked in and you were focused on what you were doing there. And that was the brilliant part about being in a writing band in the early 90s, is that when you committed to doing your thing, there was nothing that was really going to get in the way of it. And that's a harder thing, I think, for kids these days and for new musicians, is there are a ton of distractions compared to the early 90s.
We'll talk later about all the stuff that you're doing today. And I know you still pursue so many creative outlets, and Hootie and the Blowfish still gets together quite a bit. As I recall, I was at one of the shows in Bristow, Virginia in 2019, which was absolutely awesome. And you talked about it in the book. But how do you, or should I say, do you now, like when you're trying to get to a creative place, do you try and simulate some of that focus that you had in the 90s that is a little harder today because of all the devices and the things that are swirling around us? Like, are there things that you do to try and get to that space a little bit?
I personally do in my recordings, in my solo stuff, because I'm still on a notepad with a pencil in front of a piano, and my only recording device is my iPhone, which I'll click on if I get an idea that I like to make sure I can save it. But, a lot of the technology, frankly, does get in the way. There's so many tricks and bells and whistles and things you can do in production on a laptop without entering a recording studio, that for me, I'm sort of glad I don't have that tech mind, because I would probably be at a laptop 18 hours a day creating drum loops and whole song productions. It would probably be too much for me. I just prefer that simplified way, which you mentioned, where there are fewer distractions and you have to get down to the pure lyric and the pure melody you're creating. And I think that's the most important part of a song anyway.
I think that's something that is an important lesson for us to put a pin in. I think even today, with all the technology available to us, whatever somebody is working on, whether it's writing a book or music or composing emails or just spending time with their family, the importance of being where your feet are and simplifying things as much as possible. Sometimes more complicated and more tech isn't always beneficial. I'm curious, Jim, a few minutes ago, you talked about that, the notion that you couldn't get anybody to manage you. Hootie and the Blowfish in the early days couldn't get anybody to manage you. There was a point in the book that struck me where you talked about essentially pitching to a manager the idea of representing you. And he almost laughed in your face and he gave you guys some advice. I'm wondering, like, what was that experience like? What do you remember most about that? And how did you deal with setbacks like that or doubt?
That guy was Dick Hodgen, and he was a manager and producer in Raleigh, North Carolina. And he was great. He was like a very high bar for us. And, we thought we were ready to be managed. We thought we were ready for the big time. So we had a connection to him. And luckily, even though in his opinion we weren't at all ready for the big time, he was willing to be honest. And it's hard to find somebody honest at any point of a career to tell you or to estimate where you are in the journey. And so he stuck it to us pretty hard, and it only hurt because it was the truth. And he said, you're in the beginnings of your journey. You're a long ways from the big time if you're lucky enough to get there. He encouraged us. He was great. He said, you have some great songs, and if you keep writing, they'll get better, and you keep performing, you'll get better at your craft. But he knew that we were just a new band, and he knew that from his experience. So for us, we'll take the truth, and even when it hurts, it's okay. At least you got the truth.
Similarly, there were times that you guys would drive to shows. You drive 3 hours to do a gig, and there would be two people standing there. How do you dust yourself off from those? Because we've all had those moments. It may have not been on a stage playing music, but we've all had those moments where we've had big expectations. We've committed a lot of energy to something, and it just doesn't go as we had hoped. How do you dust yourself off, move forward, and stay positive?
Well, usually Jägermeister worked pretty good to push that feeling of humility or of just humiliation or disappointment away. That always worked in the beginning. And, I guess there was, in some ways, since there wasn't a big spotlight shined on us, we didn't have to be embarrassed that a whole crowd of people might think less of us. If we were worried about our reputation or what people thought of us, not many people thought anything of us at that time. So it was all what the four of us were willing to experience emotionally and deal with. And for the four of us, we could dust ourselves off. We didn't care. We were all, I use a lot of sports analogies throughout the book and in our career, but that ability to dust yourself off and just go forward is a sporting thing we all learned as kids too, is that sometimes you get your butt knocked down. Sometimes you strike out. Sometimes you have a terrible experience, but the only thing you can do is really get back up and try it again. So we were always willing to try it again.
Curious, Jim, when you think about four people working together as long as you did, as long as you have, as successfully as you have, how do you get four people with different ideas and different perspectives, like in sync? How do you do that? Like, as you reflect on that, like what do you think were some of the keys to success in that regard?
We were a little lucky, to be fair. And the reason some bands stay together as long as they do is because they have enough things in common. I mean, we all have our self-will and we all have our personal likes and dislikes, but when we kept it simple, we had enough things in common to rehearse hard, face disappointment, hop in a van, drive around, try our hardest. And we had enough there. It was partly, again, our love of music, making music, our kind of weird friendship where we could watch any sport in our free time or play a sport in our free time and be pretty amused. We were rather easily amused. So when you're out and there's only the four of you and maybe a sound man and maybe a tech, if you can't amuse yourself when there's nothing else, then you probably don't have much in common. And we always could amuse ourselves. Again, Jägermeister helped at times, but in general, it didn't take much to have us four laughing, or crying together, living life together.
So, I mean, is it fair to say from your perspective that when there's an authentic connection and a friendship, there's a foundation that you can kind of gravitate back to regardless? Like when a team likes each other, it's got to be a lot easier.
Well, yes and no. There should be, but the fact is we're evolving beings. All of us are. So the four guys that were hanging out in 1989 in the self-storage unit were not the same guys that were hanging out in 1996 after we were about to put out our second record and fame had come. We were different people. And then fast forward another, say, 10 years, you've got different things happening and families, and your whole evolution is personal. So, yes, I wish we could go back at times to feel that innocence of 1989, but the truth is we evolve, and it's harder to remain in that old, just unbreakable friendship as things evolve. It doesn't mean you can't have it. It just means it's a little harder to keep.
How do you kind of hold on to the good of the past, but accept change in people and in situations? I'm curious your thoughts on that, Jim.
Well, there's a song that we ended up putting on our album in 2019 called Change. And it talks about the one consistent that we must figure out, which is change, because having been around each other and seen life through the decades of making music together, we sort of realized, my gosh, that if we can't keep adapting to some change, we probably are going to break up or decide we don't want this or need this. And since we've evolved enough as a group and have faced some of the craziest change of any bands, it ends up working. And it's not really, I always say, it's not change. Change gets a bad name. Like we all fight change or we hate, nobody likes change. Actually, changing isn't bad. It's that transition from old ideas or old relationships into something new. And when you can't see what it's going to be when it finishes, it hurts. It's like that rock, the rock of time, the surfaces of our earth grinding through the years. It hurts when you're in a transition like that. But when you get there, you're pretty educated and more assured.
Sticking with the theme of change, Jim, you talked about it a couple of minutes ago, just the fame, and suddenly everything started to click. And, I've talked to many successful people who say, something like, it took me 10 years to become an overnight success, because it doesn't happen overnight, right? It happens in those nightclubs, in those vans, in those self-storage facilities. You guys certainly grinded it out, but Cracked Rear View becomes a massive hit. Still to this day, one of the top 10 selling albums of all time. You get the invite to David Letterman. Everything seems to kind of change overnight. All this fame, global touring, immense amount of success, #1 Billboard hits. How did you maintain that connection with the fans that I think is so synonymous with Hootie and the Blowfish, from the early days playing in bars, playing in fraternity, sorority mixers, to what I still felt in 2019 at the 25th anniversary tour for Cracked Rear View, which was a bunch of guys who just really connected well with the audience?
I don't think we actually knew how to maintain that close feeling when we first got to amphitheaters. We were in 1993 playing in our region, and we played some big clubs, sure, but in 95 we were suddenly on amphitheater stages in front of 20,000 people, and to be honest, when we got there, we didn't know what the hell we were doing. It was hard. Darius had to learn how to connect, and it took years. And I had to learn how to see my bandmates in the distance because I was still the drummer sort of towards the back of the stage, and the stage suddenly got huge. I was used to my guys right next to me, Dean's bass amp right next to my drums, Mark's guitar amp blasting my ears out, and Darius could basically turn around during a show and yell something at me and I could hear him. Suddenly when we got to amphitheaters, what do you do with all that distance? So that same thing between the bandmates also had to be, I guess, resolved with the audience. How do you connect? It takes years.
How did you, did you just let it kind of happen over time that you just thought you'd get more comfortable? Or were there things that you did intentionally to try and, accelerate that adjustment for you in your position at the drum kit?
I don't know what we ever talked about doing at all, because for years we didn't really want to change who we were. We didn't want to suddenly, because we had fame, change our outfits or our outlooks. We wanted to remain sort of authentic. And I think in some ways that may have held us back in the live show, because we just wanted to go out and play our music and be spontaneous and make sure it's real. We're not playing to any click tracks. We weren't playing to pre-recorded music. We wanted it to be fully authentic and real. And over time, I think audiences sometimes, or the competing audiences of other bands, they want a bigger show. They want something that's more lights or more movement or dancing or interaction of some sort. And we weren't able to ever really authentically move into that position. And so bands that had bigger light shows, or maybe band members that could have a different sort of interaction with the audience, they rose above and continued to play big amphitheaters. We always liked, frankly, shrinking down back into clubs. So when we would record some new music for let's say our second or third records, we'd go into the clubs and do a run of club shows. And I tell you, that always felt better. That always felt like home when you could have 400 or 500 people in a club sweating and spilling beer and running into each other and having it be a little messy. That always felt more authentic than being out there and just seeing the fans in the distance. I wouldn't trade them. I'll still take 20,000 people a night. Don't get me wrong, but there is a special feeling for Hootie the Blowfish going back and playing clubs.
I'm sure there is. I was also struck in the book by something that Darius Rucker says to the group, kind of at the height of all the success with Cracked Rear View. He says, I'm going to just make sure I get this right here. He says, "You realize we will probably never top this," he says to the band.
What a jerk.
And I'm curious, it got me thinking, what happens when you have success? Like, you guys had immense success. How do you process that mentally? Like, how do you kind of gin up the motivation to try and do something bigger? How do you stay comfortable in the future if things don't go as well as maybe things had gone in the past? Like, talk about that for a minute.
Well, we had to look at the reasons that we were in music to begin with. And we did have to sit there and face that moment of Cracked Rear View is selling so much that it's unlikely we're going to be able to do that again. That's a reality. And that's a hard one to imagine, that you're at the height of your career and you feel like you're still young in your career. You don't know if you're ever going to surpass that moment because it's gone so much bigger and faster than you thought it would. And so we had to say, well, what are we here for, guys? And we sort of sat around. It was in that same conversation that I mentioned in the book with Darius, is we sort of had to have a conversation about, well, we want to make music. What are the positives? Here's the negative. We're never going to sell like Cracked Rear View again, probably. The positives are, this might give us a foothold in the business for an entire career. And that doesn't suck. Even if the audiences come and go and we never sell this many records again, we have a good foothold to just keep making music. And that's what we wanted to do in the beginning. So isn't that enough? And it was for all of us. As much as it hurt to shrink down and get smaller and wonder where all the fans have gone years later, we're just here to make music. And if we can still do that, we should be happy.
Jim, I want to fast forward a little bit. And again, I want to encourage everybody to read the book. Your book is absolutely fascinating. And there's so much it's such a powerful discussion and so profound in terms of the adversity that you battled in terms of addiction and ultimately deciding to seek help and overcoming that battle. I can't do it justice, and I want everybody to read the book. It's incredibly powerful. But one of the things I'm curious about, Jim, is you talk so openly in the book about that long battle with addiction that lasted years and years. What ultimately led you to seek help? When you reflect on that moment where you made the decision to seek help, what was it inside you think that moment clicked?
Desperation. There's a life that is hard to understand from the outside, where addiction hurts. Addiction is not a victory. Alcohol or drug or any major obsession, but with chemicals, it becomes demoralizing. It becomes humiliating. Yet the disease is that you keep reaching back for the thing that is sort of ruining you. And that's confusing. It's frustrating. It's heartbreaking. But people will stay in that addiction, as I did, for years, because they either don't know a way out or they keep telling themselves, it's going to be different this time. I'm not going to screw up. I'm not going to get overserved. I'm not going to have a regret. But, that has taken better people than me to the grave, the hope that it's going to change or it's going to get better when they try and do it on their own. And I finally, sort of the first 4 years after 2000 were just a downhill slide for me. So as it got more painful, more ridiculous, I got a little more desperate, and eventually, sort of luckily, I had a moment of desperation, and I also had access to someone who could help me. And sometimes those don't come together, and that's the weird thing with addiction. You may on some day think, I'm ready for help, but you're still using, so you really can't get help if you're still using. Or other days you decide, I'm going to quit forever, but you're not sure where to turn, so you end up back to the chemicals. I got lucky and had a sort of a moment of, I don't know, I felt like it was some sort of God looking out for me, or maybe I just became aware at a moment that there's got to be a better way.
You describe in the book at one of the early meetings that you went to, one of the 12-step meetings, some of the other people there described at least one trait that you have to have to succeed. And that trait that they described to you is willingness. When I think about your story, I think there's so much willingness all over it. I mean, there's so much willingness in your professional career to audition for a bunch of guys in a storage unit, to drive 3 hours to play for 2 people, to adapt and change. And then obviously the willingness helped you overcome some of your biggest battles personally. Where, do you think about where that willingness comes from?
Well, I guess for the band and our willingness and the ways that we worked, it was the hopes of some glorious goal, some ability to make a great record or sign to a label or get more fans. It was always towards that vague thing called success. And when you're caught up in addiction and you have a pile of regrets and disappointments, and you're asked to stop using the thing that you've tried to medicated yourself with and change some old ideas and face that mountain of regret, you wonder, well, what's the benefit? Why do I have to do that? And they say, and basically it's because you're going to die if you don't. Are you desperate enough to do whatever it takes to get through this addiction problem? And when they say you have to face your demons, when they say you have to face the fact that your old thinking may not have been good, maybe the way of thinking that you've had for 30 years has got to be changed. It's hard. That's like, you wonder, what's the glory in that? How is that going to help me? But that's the work that has to be done for the addict to get through it.
And today you're doing such great work. You're still playing gigs with Hootie and the Blowfish. You guys are still cranking away. I love your music. You're doing a lot of solo writing and performing. You're doing a lot of motivational speaking. You're talking to big groups and small groups. I'm curious, what's been most rewarding about this phase of Jim Sonefeld's journey?
Well, I started writing. I've been writing with the band forever, but when we decided to go dormant in sort of 2008, we all were faced with what it's like to go home to wherever your home might have been in 2008, or a new home, and face, yourself. And what are you going to do musically if you're not doing it with the same three guys that you have been for a bunch of years? So we all did our version of that, and I started doing it. And I felt, since I'd had a few years of sort of a big spiritual turn, I wanted to sort of write about that celebration. So that's what I started doing. Obviously, Darius starts writing country music as we're about to go dormant, and it went pretty well from what I heard.
It's like it did.
Yeah, it's a good side job for him while he's waiting for Mark and Dean and I to call him back up. So to see him explode in that market was so awesome and just wonderful. And to see him continue to nurture that is great. But for all the writing I've done, and even starting a book and putting out my solo music and working sort of some of the spiritual seeking audiences, to come back sort of in the middle of that in 2019 and be able to do a successful tour with Hootie the Blowfish really was it was an important thing for me, and probably for all of us. None of us knew where we stood in the timeline of sort of music and successful rock bands of a 40-year period. Where was Hootie the Blowfish? We knew a great thing had happened in the mid 90s, but was it a mirage? Was it real? Could it ever reignite? And 2019 was a nice affirmation that our fans were still there, that they were willing to come out in droves to support a tour. And thank you for being one of those fans. And that just like a breath let out, a relief came out of me of just, wow, it wasn't a mirage. We have fans. We're still an authentic and legitimate music makers, and going out to tour amphitheaters was sort of proof of that. So I just loved it. It reassured my own songwriting from there out too. I could sort of say, wow, if we don't do anything else again, that sure is a hell of an ending.
Well, I hope it's not the ending, Jim. I have to admit, I was driving there that night, and I mean, as soon as the tour was announced, we bought tickets. I wanted to see you guys perform. But I'm driving there. I was having probably similar thoughts to what you were thinking at the beginning of the tour. I didn't know like how many people were going to be there or what the energy was going to be like. It had been a long time since Cracked Review, obviously 25 years. I can't tell you how cool it was for me to be a part of a packed house and just feel that energy. It brought me back, and I'm sure every night of that tour brought you back as well.
It did. That show in Virginia was one of the biggest of the whole summer. It was probably our third or fourth biggest show as far as attendance goes. And I mean, that first night when we walked out on stage, and we knew ticket sales were going well, but there's that sort of climactic moment as the curtains are about to open the first night. And we hadn't seen as a band the inside of a packed amphitheater for many, many years. We'd done House of Blues, and we'd done clubs a little bit. We played some of our charity shows here in South Carolina, but to have a curtain open up and see the entire underneath packed and see you couldn't see a blade of grass because the grass area was full. It just was, woo, so good.
Jim, as we get ready to wrap up our conversation, I just want to take you back to that moment as a kid that people pushed you to go to this drumming contest, this competition, and you were afraid to go in. You go in there and you win first place. What would you say to that kid out there, or that adult out there, anybody out there, any age, that's just afraid to take a chance?
Oh, I wish I could say one thing to spur courage in so many people who are afraid to take that leap. But I guess my thought would be, why not? Tell me why you can't do this. Tell me why what you're so hung up about that you're not going to do a thing that could change your trajectory, that could give you more courage, that could give you more confidence, that could teach you a lesson. Why not do it? And I think I had that conversation with my drum instructor and my parents, because they all three were encouraging me to do this thing. And I was the kid who's like, I can't do that. I can't get in front of people to drum. I can't learn this piece and memorize it and then drive to Chicago with my parents and sit in front of judges. I can't do that. And I think, if I remember correctly, the consensus was, why not? Why can't you do that? And I couldn't answer that. So there I went.
Why not? What a powerful message for us to end our conversation today, Jim. I know you're going to write so many more chapters in the Jim Sonefeld story, and Hootie and the Blowfish is still writing chapters in the band story. This has been a great pleasure. I have learned so much. Jim, thank you for spending a few minutes with me this week. All right.
What a great conversations. Thanks so much.
All right, Jim. I hope to see you guys out on tour sometime again soon. 35th. Let's keep doing it. All right.
You know, where are we now? Is it the I can't even remember. Is it the 20? Yeah, it's almost the 30th.
Well, 2019 was 25. We're getting close. You know, call up the manager. I'll meet you in Bristol. All right, Jim. This has been a great pleasure. All right. Take care, my friend.
Thank you for joining me this week. Be sure to subscribe in your favorite podcast app so you can catch all of our upcoming episodes. And if you are like me and want a world full of tart pullers, then leave a review to help others find us. You can also follow me on Twitter at Andrew H. Moses. That's Andrew H. Moses. And be sure to sign up for my email newsletter at everybodypullsthetart.com/newsletter. I'll share tips and insights to help you achieve maximum success and happiness. Today is a great day to pull the tarp. I am rooting for you. See you next time.